The meat is still screaming when they make us eat it. I do not mean that as metaphor. I do not mean it as the poetic language of madmen who have lost their grip upon reality. I mean that the flesh upon my tongue is producing sound, a high keening wail that vibrates through my teeth and into the bones of my skull, and I must chew and swallow regardless because the alternative is to join the meal. The taste is copper and ash, and something else, something that burns cold as it slides down my throat, and I feel it settling into my stomach like a stone that pulses with its own heartbeat. I was Velen Crade. I had a wife. I had 2 daughters. I worked the turbine halls of Manufactorum Sigma 9 on Keldrath Prime, and my hands knew the rhythm of honest labor, the sacred monotony of service to the Imperium. That man is gone now. I have served the Warband called the Inheritors of Ruin for 11 months, 14 days, and approximately 6 hours. I keep count because counting is the only thing that remains my own. Everything else, my body, my labor, my sleep, my waking hours, my very thoughts when they press close enough to read them, belongs to them now. To the monsters who walk in ceramite the color of dried blood, whose eyes glow with fires that have nothing to do with biology, whose voices scrape against the inside of reality like broken glass dragged across bone. I am one of the thralls. That is what they call us. Those of us who survived the raids, who were deemed useful enough to keep breathing, who have not yet been fed to the rituals or worked to death in the engineerium, or simply killed for the amusement of beings who have forgotten what humanity feels like. There were 347 of us when the slave holds first sealed. 11 months later, I can count the survivors on my fingers and still have digits remaining. Let me tell you how this happens. Let me give you testimony of what it means to serve the servants of chaos, to exist in their shadow, to breathe the same recycled air that has passed through lungs corrupted by 10,000 years of damnation. Let me tell you why no one survives this service. Not because death claims us, though it does, endlessly, in ways I could not have imagined before I was taken, but because survival itself becomes impossible. The person who entered the slave hold dies regardless. What emerges, if anything emerges at all, is something else entirely. The ship is called the Throne of Lies, and it is not a ship in any sense that Imperial naval doctrine would recognize. It was once, perhaps, I have seen the bones of Imperial architecture beneath the growths that cover every surface. The remnants of Aquilus, defaced and inverted. The ghost of something that was built to serve the Emperor, before it was taken and twisted into this screaming vessel of madness. The corridors pulse. I do not mean that they seem to pulse, or that the lighting creates an illusion of movement. I mean that the walls themselves expand and contract in a rhythm that matches no heartbeat I have ever known. And when I press my hand against them to steady myself, I feel warmth and wetness, and sometimes what might be a pulse pressing back against my palm. The air tastes wrong. It has tasted wrong since the moment I was dragged aboard. A wrongness that coats the tongue and seeps into the sinuses and never, ever fades. Sweet rot and ozone and incense burned over charnel offerings. These are the closest approximations I can offer, but they fail to capture the essential quality of the atmosphere, the sense that every breath is a violation, that the very act of drawing air into my lungs is somehow feeding something that should not be fed. I work the feeding lines. This is my purpose, my function, the reason I have been permitted to continue existing. The engineerium of a chaos vessel does not run on plasma alone, does not sustain itself through the mechanical processes that drive Imperial ships across the void. It requires other fuel, living fuel, and someone must tend the lines through which that fuel is delivered. must maintain the pressure and flow, must ensure that what enters the reactor hearts does so in the proper quantities at the proper times. I try not to think about what flows through those lines. I have learned that thinking is dangerous here. Questions are dangerous. Curiosity is a wound through which corruption enters, and I have seen what happens to those who ask too much, who look too closely, who fail to avert their eyes when the masters walk past with their offerings. Gelen asked. Gelen was from my manufactorum. We had worked adjacent stations for 6 years before the raid, had shared recaf during shift changes, had complained together about quotas and supervisors and the small indignities of labor. He was a good man. He had faith. He believed, truly believed, that the Emperor would deliver us, that rescue would come, that we need only endure long enough for salvation to find us. Gelen asked one of them, one of the inheritors, one of the Astartes who had given themselves to the ruinous powers. He asked what they wanted, what all of this was for, what purpose our suffering served. The Astartes laughed. I had not known they could laugh. The sound was worse than any scream I had ever heard, a wet grinding that seemed to come from everywhere at once, from the walls and the floor and the inside of my own skull. Purpose, the monster said, and its voice was honey poured over broken glass. Your suffering is the purpose. Your fear is the prayer. Your despair is the offering. Every moment you continue to breathe, you feed powers that have hungered since before your species crawled from its birth ocean. Then it showed Gelen what those powers could do with a willing vessel. The process took 4 hours. I was made to watch. We were all made to watch. Gelen is still aboard the throne of lies. Parts of him, at least. I see them sometimes, in the corners of my vision, fused to the walls in places where the ship's growth has accelerated. His mouth still moves. I do not know if he is trying to speak or scream, and I have learned not to look closely enough to find out. This is the first lesson of serving a Chaos Warband. There is no rescue. There is no salvation. There is no duration of suffering after which deliverance arrives. There is only the service and the slow dissolution and the eventual end that comes in whatever form the gods or their servants deem most amusing. I have 11 months of testimony to offer. 11 months of witnessing what should not be witnessed, of surviving what should not be survived, of watching the people around me die in ways that expanded my understanding of what death could mean. Let me tell you how we tried to remain human. Let me tell you how we failed. The sleep cycles are the worst, not because of what happens during them, though what happens during them is terrible beyond measure, but because of what they reveal about the nature of this place, about the impossibility of rest, about the way the ship itself seems to feed upon the unconscious mind. I learned early that true sleep was forbidden to us, not by decree, not by the commands of our masters, but by the simple architecture of reality aboard the throne of lies. When I close my eyes, when exhaustion finally drags me down into something resembling unconsciousness, I do not dream. I travel. My mind slips loose from my body and wanders corridors that do not exist in the waking world, passages that twist through geometries that hurt to remember, chambers where things wait with patient hunger for exactly such lost souls to stumble into their domain. I woke once with blood beneath my fingernails and no memory of how it came to be there. I woke once speaking words in a language I did not know, syllables that burned my throat as they emerged and left blisters on my lips that took days to heal. I woke once and found that I had walked in my sleep to the edge of the feeding pools, that I stood with my toes curled over the lip of that churning darkness, that something vast and formless was rising from the depths to meet me. Mira pulled me back. She was the one who saved me that night, her hands on my shoulders, her voice cutting through whatever trance had claimed me. I did not know her name then. I learned it later, learned that she had been a Scholem teacher on a world called Viridian's Hope, learned that she had watched her students fed one by one into the maw of a demon engine and had somehow kept her sanity through all of it. She should not have saved me. Every moment of energy expended on another thrall was a moment stolen from one's own survival, a resource squandered on someone who would likely die within the week regardless. The mathematics of this place did not reward compassion. And yet, she pulled me back, and she held me until the trembling stopped, and she whispered words that I think were supposed to be prayers, though they came out broken and incomplete. "We have to remember," she said to me, in the darkness of the thrall holds where we were permitted to rest between shifts. "We have to remember who we were, what we were. If we forget, they win. If we forget, we become like them." I wanted to believe her. Emperor, forgive me. I wanted to believe that memory was armor, that identity was a fortress that could withstand the siege of this place. But I had already begun to feel the erosion, the slow wearing away of everything I had once been certain of. My wife's face was growing blurry in my recollection. My daughter's voices were fading into static. The life I had lived before the raid was becoming a story I had once heard, rather than a truth I had once inhabited. This is what they do not tell you about serving chaos. It is not the violence that destroys you, though the violence is constant and terrible. It is not the horror, though the horror exceeds anything the human mind was built to process. It is the erosion, the slow, patient dissolution of everything that once made you whole. Day by day, hour by hour, breath by breath, you become less. And there is no moment of dramatic transformation, no threshold you cross from human to something else. There is only the gradual realization that the person you remember being could not possibly have survived this long, and therefore you must be someone else entirely. The masters knew this. They cultivated it. I came to understand that our suffering was not incidental to their purposes, but essential to them. That we were not merely slaves, but offerings, not merely labor, but sacrifice. That every moment of our continued existence fed something that hungered in dimensions I could not perceive. I met Vosk on my 34th day aboard the Throne of Lies. He was not like the others, not like the broken thralls who shuffled through their duties with hollow eyes, not like the mad ones who had surrendered to the whispers and now served with terrible enthusiasm. Vosk was sharp. His eyes held a clarity that seemed impossible in this place, a focus that cut through the fog of despair like a blade through smoke. He found me in the feeding line maintenance tunnels, in a junction where the pipes converged, and the sound of what flowed through them was loud enough to mask conversation. He did not introduce himself, did not ask my name, did not waste breath on pleasantries. "You still count the days," he said. It was not a question. I nodded, uncertain whether this was a test, whether he had been sent by the masters to identify those who still clung to their former lives. "Good. Keep counting. The ones who stop counting are the ones who have already begun to turn." He leaned closer, and I saw the scars that covered his scalp, the places where something had been carved into his flesh and then burned away. There are 9 of us, 9 who still remember, 9 who are planning something. Hope is a dangerous thing aboard a chaos vessel. It opens doors that should remain sealed, creates vulnerabilities that the things which dwell in the warp can exploit. I had learned to smother hope, to crush it whenever it flickered to life in my chest, to treat it as the poison it inevitably became in this place. But Vosk's words kindled something I could not entirely extinguish. 9 survivors. 9 who remembered. 9 who were planning. Planning what? I whispered. Escape, he said, and the word itself seemed to change the air around us, to charge it with something that felt almost like possibility. Not from the ship. That is impossible. We would die in the void long before rescue could find us. But there are other ways. The ship will make port eventually. They always do. They need supplies that cannot be synthesized, materials that must be harvested from real space. When that happens, there will be a window, narrow, brief, but real. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe that escape was possible, that survival meant something more than simple continuation, that there was a future beyond the walls of this screaming vessel. I should have recognized the trap. I should have understood that hope itself was the bait, that the architecture of this place was designed to cultivate exactly such fragile shoots of optimism, so that they could be torn out by the roots at the moment of maximum despair. But I was weak. I was tired. I was so desperate for something to hold on to that I would have grasped at anything, even a blade that cut my palms as I clutched it. "What do you need from me?" I asked. Vosk smiled, and for a moment, just a moment, I thought I saw something flicker behind his eyes, something that was not entirely human, something that had been watching and waiting, and was now deeply, terribly pleased. "Just keep working the feeding lines," he said. "Keep your eyes open, and when the time comes, be ready to move." He left me there in the junction, surrounded by the sound of things flowing through pipes that should not have been warm to the touch, and I stood for a long time afterward, trying to convince myself that I had not just made a terrible mistake. The days that followed were different. I had purpose now, or what felt like purpose, which in this place might have been worse than purposelessness. I watched. I listened. I noted the patterns of the master's movements, the rhythms of the ship's operations, the moments when the corridors were empty, and the moments when they swarmed with activity. I found the others, or they found me. Mira was among them, and learning this filled me with a relief I had not expected. There was Torvin, an old man whose hands shook but whose mind remained sharp as a monofilament blade. There was Kesson, who had been a pilot once and still bore the interface ports that had connected her to her vessel's machine spirit. There was Gent, who never spoke of what he had been before, and whose eyes held a darkness that made even the other thralls uneasy. 9 of us, meeting in the hidden spaces of the ship, whispering plans in the stolen hours between shifts, mapping routes and timing patrols, and slowly, carefully, constructing the architecture of our impossible escape. I should have noticed that Vosk was never present at these meetings. I should have questioned why our apparent leader never participated in the planning he had initiated. But hope had made me blind, had sealed my eyes against the obvious wrongness of our situation, had convinced me that salvation was possible if only I believed strongly enough. The masters came for us on the 47th day. They did not come with violence, not at first. They simply appeared in the maintenance junction where we had gathered, 7 of the inheritors in their corrupted ceramite, their bolters held loose at their sides, their eyes glowing with that awful inner fire. And at their head, walking with the casual confidence of a predator among prey, was Vosk. He was not wearing the rags of a thrall anymore. He was clad in robes of deep crimson, marked with symbols that hurt to look upon, and the scars on his scalp had been reopened, fresh blood trickling down his face in patterns that seemed almost deliberate. "Thank you," he said to us, and his voice was different now, layered with harmonics that had not been there before. "You have given us exactly what we needed. Hope is such a rare commodity among the broken ones. It takes time to cultivate, patience to nurture. But the harvest is always worth the wait. Mira moved first. She did not run, there was nowhere to run, but she stepped forward, placing herself between Vosk and the rest of us. Her shoulders squared despite the trembling I could see in her hands. "Whatever you are," she said, "whatever you've become, you were human once. You must remember. You must." Vosk's hand moved faster than my eyes could track. One moment Mira was standing, defiant, still trying to reach whatever shred of humanity might remain in the creature before her. The next moment she was on the floor, her throat opened from ear to ear, her blood spreading across the deck plates in a pool that seemed too large, too dark, that steamed where it touched the metal. She did not die quickly. That was the worst part. She lay there, her hands pressed to the wound that could not be stanched, her eyes finding mine as the light slowly faded from them, her lips moving in words that might have been prayers, or might have been curses, or might have been my name. I will never know. I will never know, because I stood there frozen while she bled out at my feet and did nothing. "Take them," Vosk said, stepping over Mira's body as though it were merely an obstacle, an inconvenience, a thing of no more significance than a stone in his path. "The harvester has been asking for fresh stock. These will do nicely." The Astartes moved forward, and I learned what it meant to be taken by the servants of chaos. Not in the chaos of a raid, not in the confusion of battle, but with slow deliberation, with patient cruelty, with the certain knowledge that everything that followed would be designed to extract the maximum possible suffering from what remained of my existence. They separated us. That was the first cruelty. Torvin was dragged in one direction, Kessin in another, Ghent in a third. I heard screaming from somewhere deep in the ship, and I did not know whose voice it was, and the not knowing was its own form of torture. I was taken to a chamber I had not known existed, a space at the heart of the vessel where the walls were covered in script that writhed and shifted when I tried to read it, where the air was so thick with incense and blood smell that every breath felt like drowning. And there, in the center of that chamber, I saw what they called the Harvester. I will not describe it. I cannot describe it. There are configurations of flesh and metal, and something else entirely that the human mind simply refuses to process, that slide off the surface of consciousness like water off polished stone. I saw it, and I knew that I was seeing it, and I understood that I would carry the memory of it for whatever remained of my existence. But I could not then, and cannot now, assemble those impressions into anything resembling coherent description. It spoke to me, not in words, not in sounds, but in sensations that bypassed my ears entirely and wrote themselves directly upon the meat of my brain. "You hoped," it said, and the concept carried with it a vast amusement, an ancient and terrible mirth. How delicious, how rare, how very, very useful. I understood then what Vosk had done. I understood that the entire escape plan had been a cultivation, a careful tending of something precious and fragile that could now be harvested at its peak. Our hope, our desperate, foolish, beautiful hope, had been grown like a crop, nurtured like a garden, and was now being reaped by powers that fed upon such things. This was not cruelty for its own sake. This was agriculture. This was husbandry. This was the patient cultivation of suffering by beings who had refined the process over millennia. And I was the harvest. What followed was not torture, though it contained elements that might be classified as such by those who have never experienced the true depths of what conscious beings can inflict upon one another. Torture implies purpose, the extraction of information, the punishment of transgression, the breaking of will towards some specific end. What the harvester did to me had no such limited ambition. It was refinement. I was placed in a device that held my body immobile, while leaving my mind entirely, terribly free. I could not move, could not close my eyes, could not turn my head away from whatever was placed before me. But I could think, I could feel, I could experience every sensation with a clarity that seemed enhanced rather than dulled, as though the device was somehow amplifying my capacity for suffering rather than diminishing it. The harvester worked on me for what felt like years. I know now that it was only 6 days. I learned this later when I was returned to the thrall holds and could once again count the passage of time. But those 6 days contained eternities. It opened me. Not physically, though there was physical opening as well. Incisions that healed almost as quickly as they were made, leaving no scars but leaving memories that would never fade. It opened my mind, peeled back the layers of identity and memory and self that I had spent a lifetime constructing. And it looked at what lay beneath. I saw myself through its perception. I witnessed the totality of my existence from a perspective that was not my own. Every moment of joy I had ever experienced, every flash of love, every instant of peace, all of it catalogued and examined and somehow tasted by an intelligence that found such emotions more delicious than any physical sustenance. It fed upon my memories of happiness the way a man might savor a rare vintage, rolling each recollection across its consciousness with evident appreciation. And when it had consumed everything bright within me, it turned its attention to the darkness. The fears I had never spoken, the shames I had buried so deep I had almost forgotten them, the moments of weakness and cruelty and pettiness that every human being accumulates over the course of a life lived among other human beings. All of it drawn forth and examined and amplified and fed back into me until I experienced each failing as though for the first time, until I understood with terrible clarity exactly how small and broken and worthless I truly was. This is the second lesson of serving a Chaos Warband. You will be known, utterly, completely, without reservation or mercy. Every secret you have kept, every lie you have told yourself, every comfortable delusion that has allowed you to function, all of it will be stripped away, and you will be forced to confront the naked truth of your own inadequacy. I emerged from the harvester's chamber as something less than I had been. Not broken, breaking implies a clean separation, a moment of rupture after which the pieces might theoretically be reassembled. I was diminished. Portions of myself had been consumed and would never return, leaving empty spaces in my psyche where memories and emotions had once resided. I could no longer remember my wife's face. I knew that I had loved her, the intellectual knowledge remained, but the feeling itself was gone, excised as cleanly as a tumor, leaving only scar tissue where warmth had once resided. My daughters had become abstractions, names without faces, concepts without emotional weight. The harvester had taken my capacity for love and left me with only the memory that such capacity had once existed. The others had fared no better. Torvin was returned to the thrall holds 3 days after me, and the man who came back bore little resemblance to the sharp-minded elder I had known. He sat in the corner of our sleeping space and rocked back and forth, his lips moving in constant silent conversation with something only he could perceive. His hands no longer shook. They were perfectly still now, folded in his lap, with a precision that seemed mechanical rather than intentional. Kessin never came back. I asked once what had become of her, asked one of the thralls who had been aboard longer than I, who had survived through a combination of usefulness and invisibility. He looked at me with eyes that held no curiosity, no sympathy, no anything at all, and he pointed toward the engineerium. "The feeding lines," he said. "She's part of the ship now." I did not ask for clarification. I did not want to know what that meant. But I found out anyway, because this place does not permit the mercy of ignorance. I was assigned to maintenance duty in the deep engineerium 2 weeks after my release from the harvester's chamber. The work was brutal, crawling through access tunnels barely wide enough to accommodate a human body, replacing components that had corroded in the acidic atmosphere, clearing blockages in pipes that carried substances I refused to examine too closely. The heat was immense, pressing against my skin like a physical weight, and the air tasted of metal and something else, something organic, something alive. I found Kirsten on my 3rd day in the deep engineerium. She had been incorporated into the wall of a junction chamber, her body fused with the pipes and conduits that carried the ship's lifeblood. Her eyes were open, staring at nothing, but they tracked my movement as I entered the space. Her mouth was open too, stretched wide around a pipe that entered through her throat and exited somewhere I could not see, somewhere deep in the tangle of flesh and metal that her torso had become. She was still alive. The ship was keeping her alive, using her as a component, a junction point, a piece of biological machinery in a system that defied all rational understanding. And she was aware. I could see it in her eyes, the terrible consciousness that remained even as her body was transformed into something that served the vessel's incomprehensible needs. I stood before her for a long time. I did not know what to say. What words could possibly address such a fate? What comfort could be offered to someone who had been reduced to this? Her eyes found mine, and I saw something in them that might have been recognition. Her lips moved around the pipe that violated her throat, shaping words that could not be spoken, messages that could not be delivered. I think she was asking me to kill her. I think that was what she wanted, the mercy of ending, the release from this eternal mechanical service. But I did not have a weapon, and even if I had, I do not know whether I would have had the courage to use it. The ship was watching. The ship was always watching. And those who interfered with its components did not survive to regret their interference. I left her there. I walked away from the junction chamber and continued my maintenance duties. And I told myself that there was nothing I could have done, that my survival depended on my usefulness, that sentiment was a luxury I could no longer afford. These are the lies we tell ourselves. These are the small surrenders that accumulate, one upon another, until we look back and realize that we have given away everything that once made us human. The mathematics of this place defy comprehension. I calculated once, in the hollow hours between shifts, trying to understand the scale of what I was witnessing. The throne of lies had been raiding imperial space for over 3 centuries. I learned this from the older thralls, from the fragments of history that circulated among those who had survived long enough to accumulate such knowledge. 300 years of harvest, of cultivation, of refinement. The ship required approximately 400 thralls to maintain basic function. This was the minimum, the skeleton crew that kept the feeding lines flowing and the engineerium operational. Average thrall's survival time was estimated at 18 months, though this number was skewed by the rapid attrition of new captures and the handful of veterans who had somehow endured for decades. 400 thralls, replaced every 18 months on average, 300 years of operation. I did the mathematics. I multiplied and divided and converted, and when I arrived at the final number, I understood why the ship's walls sometimes seemed to press inward, why the corridors pulsed with something that felt almost like breathing. why the very structure of the vessel seemed to be composed of something more than metal and ceramite. 80,000 souls. At minimum, 80,000 human beings had been fed into this vessel over the course of its existence, their bodies consumed by its systems, their suffering harvested by its masters, their essence absorbed into the screaming architecture that surrounded me. The ship was not merely decorated with the remnants of its victims, the ship was built from them. Every wall contained the compressed residue of thousands of lives. Every corridor was paved with the spiritual detritus of the consumed. The throne of lies was less a vessel than a mass grave that had learned to fly, a charnel monument that traversed the stars in search of fresh material with which to expand its hungry bulk. Across the galaxy, I would later learn, 10,000 such vessels plied the void, 10,000 monuments to suffering, each with its own centuries of harvest, each with its own mountains of dead. The ruinous powers did not merely corrupt individuals, they built civilizations of agony, architectures of despair that spanned the stars and would endure long after the last loyal servant of the Emperor had fallen. I worked. I survived. I watched others fail to survive. And I noted each death with the clinical detachment that had become my only defense against the constant horror. Torvald stopped eating on the 63rd day and was dead by the 68th. I found his body in the corner of the thrall hold where he had spent his final weeks, his face frozen in an expression of what might have been peace, or might have been the final surrender of a mind that had simply ceased to function. Ghent lasted longer, almost to the 4th month, before he was selected for one of the rituals, and I heard his screams echoing through the corridors for 3 days straight before they finally, mercifully stopped. Of the 9 who had gathered in that maintenance junction, who had whispered plans of escape and allowed ourselves to believe that salvation was possible, I alone remained. The others had been consumed in various ways, physically, spiritually, psychologically, until only I was left to bear witness to our collective folly. And still I survived. Still, I worked the feeding lines and cleared the blockages and maintained the systems that kept this vessel of horrors functioning. Still, I woke each morning and counted the days and told myself that survival was its own form of victory, even as I felt myself becoming less and less recognizable as the man who had once lived a simple life in the turbine halls of Manufactorum Sigma Nj. The 7th month brought changes. The ship emerged from the warp into real space, and I felt the transition in my bones, a sudden lessening of pressure, a clearing of the perpetual fog that clouded thought and perception, a momentary return of something that felt almost like clarity. The whispers that constantly pressed against the edges of my consciousness grew quieter, though they did not cease entirely. The walls stopped pulsing with such obvious vitality. We had arrived somewhere. The ship had found new hunting grounds. I learned later that we had entered a system called Veritas Tertius, home to 3 inhabited worlds and a population of approximately 4 billion souls. I learned that the inheritors had been planning this raid for decades, cultivating contacts among the system's defense forces, weakening the orbital platforms through sabotage and corruption, preparing the way for harvest. 4 billion people. I thought about that number as I worked my shift, as I moved through corridors that seemed almost peaceful in the relative quiet of real space. 4 billion lives, going about their daily routines, unaware that something ancient and hungry had just entered their system with patient, terrible intent. The raids began 3 days later. I was not part of the landing forces. Thralls were rarely risked in direct combat. Our value lay in our continued service rather than our martial capability. But I felt the ship's excitement as the first drop pods were launched, as the first Thunderhawks screamed toward the planet below. The Throne of Lies trembled with something like anticipation, its walls pulsing faster, its corridors growing warmer, as though the vessel itself was salivating at the prospect of fresh material. The first captives arrived within 12 hours. I saw them herded through the intake corridors, hundreds of men and women and children with the same expression I had worn 11 months ago: terror, disbelief, the desperate hope that this was somehow a mistake that could be corrected. I watched them processed, sorted, assigned to the various functions the ship required, and I felt nothing. That was when I understood what had happened to me. That was when I realized that the Harvester had taken more than my memories of love, more than my capacity for connection. It had taken my ability to see these new captives as people rather than resources. I looked at them and I saw only their potential uses, who would survive long enough to be useful, who would break quickly and be fed to the rituals, who might possess skills that would earn them a few extra months of existence. I had become what this place wanted me to become, not through dramatic transformation, not through the obvious corruptions that twisted the flesh of the masters. I had been hollowed out and refilled with something cold and practical and utterly divorced from the humanity I had once possessed. The man called Velen Craid was truly dead now. What remained was merely a function, a component, a piece of the ship's machinery that happened to still wear human flesh. And the worst part, the part that haunted me in the quiet hours between shifts, was that I could not remember why this should matter. The girl arrived on the 8th day of the harvest. I should not have noticed her. The intake processing had become routine by then. Hundreds of captives flowing through the corridors each day, faces blurring together into a single composite of terror and despair that had long since ceased to register as individual human beings. I had learned to look without seeing, to observe without processing, to let the parade of suffering wash over me like water over stone. But she was singing. It was a hymn, a simple thing, a children's prayer song that I had not heard since my own daughters were small, since I had stood beside their sleeping cots and listened to them murmur the words into their pillows as they drifted toward dreams. The melody cut through the fog of my detachment like a blade through rotting cloth, opening something in my chest that I had thought permanently sealed. She was perhaps 8 years old. Her hair was dark and matted with blood that was not her own. Her eyes were wide, but not empty. There was something in them that should not have survived the journey to this place, a spark that the Throne of Lies had not yet managed to extinguish. She walked among the other captives with her small hand clasped in the grip of a woman who might have been her mother. And she sang as she walked, the words emerging in a thin voice that trembled but did not break. Emperor of mankind, Father of light, guard your children through the night. Keep us safe from Shadow's call. Hold us close and catch our fall. I knew those words. I had sung them myself decades ago, in a chapel on Keldrath Prime, where the stained glass windows filtered the sunlight into colors I could no longer quite remember. I had sung them to my daughters in the quiet hours when nightmares woke them and they needed comfort. I had believed them once, believed that the Emperor heard such prayers, that faith offered protection, that the light could hold back the darkness. The girl's voice faltered as she passed through the intake checkpoint, as the processing servitors marked her for assignment, and the older thralls began separating the new arrivals into their designated groups. But she did not stop singing. Even as the woman beside her, her mother, her aunt, her guardian I never learned, was pulled away toward the engineerium drafts. Even as she was left standing alone in the corridor with nothing but her hymn and her terror, she kept singing. I should have looked away. I should have continued with my duties, maintained my invisibility, preserved the careful numbness that had allowed me to survive where so many others had fallen. Sentiment was suicide in this place. Attachment was a wound through which corruption entered. I did not look away. I crossed the corridor. I knelt before her, bringing my face level with hers, and I saw the moment when her song faltered and died. When she realized that I was one of them now, one of the servants, one of the broken things that kept this vessel functioning. Her eyes searched my face for something human, something recognizable, something that might offer hope. I do not know what she found there. I do not know what expression I wore, what my features had become after 11 months of erosion and emptiness. But she did not pull away. She stood perfectly still, her small hands clenched at her sides, and she waited for whatever I was going to do to her. "What is your name?" I asked. My voice sounded strange to my own ears, rusty, unused for anything but functional communication, unpracticed in the simple art of human conversation. "Sarah," she whispered. "Sarah Wilholm. My mother. They took my mother. I know. Is she? Will they? I do not know." It was the truth. It was also a lie, because I knew what happened to those assigned to the engineering drafts, knew the fate that awaited anyone deemed suitable for incorporation into the ship's systems. But I could not make myself speak that truth to this child who still sang hymns in the corridors of hell. The processing thrall approached, an old man whose name I had never learned, whose face I had never bothered to study, who existed in my awareness only as a function rather than a person. He carried a brand in his hand, the marking iron that would designate the girl's initial assignment, and his eyes held the same emptiness I had seen in my own reflection. "This one is young," he said, consulting a slate that displayed the day's quotas. "The blood priests have requested fresh subjects for the consecration rituals. She fits the parameters." I knew what that meant. I had witnessed the consecration rituals, had seen what remained of those who were selected for them. The blood priests served powers that hungered specifically for innocence, that found the suffering of children particularly nourishing, that had refined techniques over millennia for extracting the maximum possible agony from minds not yet hardened by experience. The girl would not survive the night, and her death would be neither quick nor merciful. Something moved in my chest. Something stirred in the hollow spaces where my humanity had once resided. It was not courage. I had lost the capacity for courage long ago. It was not compassion, precisely, for I could not remember what compassion felt like. It was something older, something more fundamental, a reflex that had somehow survived the systematic destruction of everything else I had once been. "She has value," I heard myself say. "The feeding lines require smaller bodies for the tertiary maintenance tunnels. The current crew is too large for effective access. She fits the parameters better than any recent intake." The processing thrall paused, his brand hovering in the air between us. His empty eyes studied my face, searching for deception, for motivation, for anything that might explain this unprecedented intervention. "You are making a request?" I am identifying a resource allocation inefficiency. It was the right language. It was the vocabulary of function and utility that this place understood, that the thralls had learned to speak in lieu of anything resembling human communication. The processing thrall considered my words, consulted his slate, ran calculations that weighed the competing demands of the blood priests against the operational needs of the feeding line maintenance crews. Your observation has merit, he said finally. The tertiary tunnels have been understaffed since the last maintenance rotation. She will be assigned to your section. He turned away, moving to the next captive in line, already forgetting the small deviation from routine that had just occurred. The girl, Sarah, stood frozen, her eyes fixed on my face with an intensity that made me want to look away, to retreat back into the comfortable numbness that had protected me for so long. You saved me, she whispered. I delayed you, I corrected. Nothing more. This place does not permit salvation. But even as I spoke the words, I felt something shifting in the architecture of my emptiness. A crack had formed in the walls I had built around myself, a fissure through which light threatened to enter. I had done something that was not purely functional, something that served no purpose beyond the preservation of a single small life that would likely be extinguished regardless within weeks or months. I had remembered, if only for a moment, what it felt like to be human. The days that followed were strange. I trained Sarah in the work of the tertiary maintenance tunnels, taught her which blockages could be cleared and which must be reported, showed her the safe paths through the crawl spaces and the danger signs that preceded catastrophic system failures. She learned quickly. Children adapt, even to horrors that should be beyond their comprehension. And within a week, she was navigating the tunnels with a competence that rivaled thralls who had served for months. She still sang, sometimes. In the quiet moments between tasks, in the darkness of the narrowest passages where no one could hear, she would murmur the words of her hymn, and I would listen, and I would remember things I had thought forever lost. I did not allow myself to care for her. I could not afford such vulnerability, not in this place where attachment was merely prelude to loss. But I found myself watching for her in the thrall holds, noting her presence with something that was not quite relief, but was closer to that emotion than anything I had experienced in months. I found myself adjusting schedules to ensure she was assigned to sections where the danger was marginally less severe. I found myself doing small things that served no purpose except to slightly improve her chances of surviving another day. The masters noticed. Of course they noticed. Nothing escaped their attention. No deviation from expected behavior went unobserved. No crack in the careful architecture of despair failed to register in their eternal vigilance. Vosk came for me on the 94th day. He found me in the junction chamber, where I had once discovered Kessen's transformed remains, where I now performed routine maintenance while trying not to look at the thing that had been a woman I had known. He moved through the doorway with the fluid grace of something no longer bound by human limitations, and his eyes, his terrible, knowing eyes, fixed upon me with an expression that might have been amusement or might have been hunger. You have been busy, he said. The others have noted your investment in the Wilhelm child. I did not respond. There was nothing to say that he did not already know. No defense that would not sound hollow in the face of his absolute knowledge. Hope is fascinating, he continued, circling me slowly, his crimson robes brushing against the pipes that lined the walls. We cultivate it, of course. You experienced that cultivation yourself, did you not? The conspiracy, the planning, the beautiful delusion that escape was possible. But what you have done is different. You have not allowed yourself to hope for rescue or freedom. You have hoped only for the survival of one small child, and somehow that makes your hope more potent. He stopped before me, close enough that I could smell the incense and blood that clung to his robes, close enough that I could see the fresh scars that had been carved into his scalp since our last encounter. The harvester has taken an interest in you again, It wishes to understand how you reconstructed something it was certain it had destroyed. It wishes to explore the mechanisms by which shattered vessels can somehow seal their cracks and hold water once more. I felt the cold spreading through my chest, the familiar paralysis of absolute terror that I had learned to recognize in the moments before catastrophe. The Harvester. 6 days that had felt like centuries. The systematic destruction of everything that had once made me human. And the girl, I asked, because I had to know. Because not knowing would be worse than any answer he could provide. Vosk smiled. It was not a human expression, not really. There was too much knowledge in it, too much ancient cruelty, too much pleasure in the suffering it anticipated. The girl will watch. The Harvester finds that observation enhances the experience. Subjects who know their suffering is being witnessed by those they care for tend to produce particularly exquisite responses. He gestured toward the doorway, and 2 of the inheritors entered. Astartes in corrupted ceramite, their bolters held ready, their eyes glowing with that terrible inner fire. They moved toward me with the mechanical precision of beings who had long since ceased to feel anything resembling hesitation or mercy. "Come," Vosk said. "The Harvester is waiting. And this time, I think the process will be much more thorough." They dragged me through corridors that pulsed with anticipation, past thralls who averted their eyes and pretended not to see, toward the chamber at the heart of the ship where something ancient and hungry waited to consume whatever remained of the man I had once been. And in the distance, growing closer with each step, I heard a thin voice singing a hymn I had almost forgotten. "Emperor of mankind, Father of light, guard your children through the night." Sarah was already there. They had brought her first, had positioned her where she would have an unobstructed view of everything that was about to happen. Her face was pale, but her eyes were dry. She had learned, in her weeks aboard the throne of lies, that tears accomplished nothing except the amusement of those who fed upon suffering. The Harvester unfolded before me, and I understood that this time there would be no emergence, no return to the thrallholds, no continuation of the hollow existence I had been living. This time, the consumption would be complete. But Sarah was still singing, even here, even now, even in the presence of something that should have silenced every voice and crushed every spirit. She was still singing. And I realized, in that final moment before the Harvester began its work, that she was singing for me, that her thin voice was a lifeline thrown across an impossible gulf, an anchor of human connection in a sea of cosmic horror, that even if I did not survive what was about to happen, something would remain. A memory, a moment, a single act of defiance against powers that sought to convince us that love was weakness and hope was foolishness. I looked at her, and I tried to remember what my daughters' faces had looked like, and I found that I could not. The Harvester had taken that from me, and would take more, and would eventually take everything. But it could not take the sound of her voice. It could not unmake the choice I had made when I stepped across that corridor and spoke words that served no purpose except to save one small life from the blood priest's consecration. It could not erase the fact that, even here, even after everything, I had found something worth protecting. The Harvester reached for me, and Sarah's voice rose to meet it, and I closed my eyes and let the darkness take me. This was the third lesson of serving a Chaos Warband. They can take everything from you, every memory and every hope and every capacity for human connection, and still you can choose what to give. They cannot steal what is freely offered. They cannot corrupt what is given in love. I gave myself to the darkness, and I was at peace. I did not die. I wish I could tell you that death found me in that chamber, that the harvester consumed what remained and granted me the mercy of ending. I wish I could tell you that Sarah's song was the last thing I heard, that her voice carried me into whatever waits beyond the veil of mortal existence. But chaos does not grant such mercies. The ruinous powers are not interested in endings. They are interested in continuation, in the eternal extension of suffering, in the perpetual harvest of souls that can be broken and remade and broken again, across spans of time that dwarf the lifespan of stars. I am still aboard the throne of lies. I have been aboard for 43 years now, though time has become a fluid thing, unreliable, measured more by the rhythm of raids and harvests than by any objective standard. My body has been rebuilt 17 times. The masters find it amusing to repair what they have damaged, to restore what they have consumed, to return me again and again to something resembling function so that the process can begin anew. Sarah lived for 4 more years after that day in the harvester's chamber. She grew tall and thin and silent, her hymns fading into memory, her spark dimming with each passing month until she was indistinguishable from the other thralls who shuffled through their duties with empty eyes. I watched her transformation. I was made to watch, as I had been made to watch Gelen, as I had been made to watch so many others. She did not die screaming. That is the only comfort I can offer, the only light I can find in the darkness of her ending. When the blood priests finally came for her, when her usefulness as a maintenance thrall had been exhausted and her value as a sacrifice had ripened to its peak, she went quietly, her hand finding mine for one brief moment before they led her away. She did not sing, but she smiled, and in that smile, I saw something that the Throne of Lies had never managed to extinguish, something that had survived 4 years of horror and emerged somehow intact. She had not forgotten how to love, even here, even after everything. I carry that smile with me now, through the decades of service that have followed, through the endless cycle of raids and harvests and consumptions. The harvester has taken my memories of my wife and daughters so many times that I no longer know if the faces I sometimes glimpse in dreams are real or manufactured, echoes of something true or phantoms created to torment me. But it has never managed to take Sarah's smile. Some things, I have learned, are beyond even the reach of chaos. I am still counting the days. 43 years, 2 months, 17 days. The number is meaningless. Time stretches and compresses in ways that make measurement absurd. But I count regardless, because counting is the only thing that remains my own. No one survives serving a Chaos Warband. This is the truth I promise to share, the testimony I have carried through 4 decades of impossible continuation. The person who enters this service dies, inevitably and completely, regardless of whether the body continues to function. What remains is something else, something hollowed and refilled, something broken and rebuilt, something that wears the shape of humanity without possessing its substance. But even the hollowed can choose what to carry in their emptiness. Even the broken can decide what shape their pieces will take when they fall. I chose to carry a song. I chose to carry a smile. And when the Throne of Lies finally releases me, when the masters tire of their game and grant me the ending I have long since ceased to pray for, I will go into that darkness with something they could not take, something they could not corrupt, something that remained human despite everything they did to destroy it. This is my testimony. Let it be enough.